They left no letters. This is the first thing you need to understand about the people I want to take you to, and it is a harder constraint than it sounds. We are accustomed, in the study of history, to working with texts, with the letters and the chronicles and the administrative records and the poems and the laws that the literate civilizations of the ancient world left behind. We read Cicero, and we know what Cicero thought. We read the Linear B tablets, and we know what was in the storerooms of the Mycenaean palaces. We read the cuneiform from the House of Wisdom, and we can follow, word by word, the argument about whether Aristotle was right. The people I want to take you to wrote nothing. Not because they were less intelligent, not because they had nothing to say, not because their lives were less complex or less organized or less worthy of record, but because writing, that specific technology of preserved symbolic communication, had not yet reached them or had not yet been developed by them in the specific time and place I am describing. They lived in Northern and Western Europe in the Neolithic period and the Bronze Age, roughly between 4,000 and 1,000 years before the Common Era, and they left behind not words but things, stones, bones, metal objects, the residue of fires, the shapes cut into bedrock and chalk hillsides, the specific impressions of their hands in the clay of their pottery, the chemical signature of where they grew up, preserved in the enamel of their teeth, readable only by the mass spectrometers of a future they could not have imagined. And Stonehenge. Stonehenge is, in the specific sense that matters here, the most important surviving object from the preliterate world of Northern Europe. And I want to approach it carefully because it has accumulated so much mythology and so much dubious interpretation over the centuries that getting to the actual thing, to what we know and what we don't know, and what the archaeology tells us, requires cutting through several layers of accumulated speculation. The Druids did not build it. The Celts did not build it. It was not a monument to the wisdom of some esoteric mystery tradition preserved through the ages. It was built by specific people who lived specific lives, who had specific reasons for building it in this specific way, in this specific place. And those specific people are almost entirely unknown to us, except through the physical evidence of what they made. Let me give you what we do know. The construction of Stonehenge was not a single event, but a process that unfolded over roughly 1,500 years, from approximately 3000 BCE to approximately 1500 BCE. The earliest phase of the monument was a circular earthwork, a ditch and bank enclosure, created around 3000 BCE. This phase is visible in the landscape as the outermost circular feature of the site, and it contained in its initial form a ring of holes whose original contents, posts, stones, or some other upright material, are no longer present. The human cremation burials that have been found in and around the earthwork suggest that from its earliest phase, Stonehenge was used as a site for the dead, or for ceremonies related to the dead, or for something that archaeologists describe carefully as ritual activity. The specific phrase scholars use when they know something was important and deliberate but cannot determine what it was for. The famous stones, the massive sarsen stones and the smaller bluestones that constitute the most recognizable image of Stonehenge, arrived in several phases between roughly 2500 and 1500 BCE. The bluestones came first in the configuration we recognize, transported from the Preseli Hills in what is now Pembrokeshire in southwest Wales, a distance of approximately 240 kilometres. The sarsens came from Marlborough Downs, about 30 kilometres to the north. The largest sarsen stones weigh approximately 25 tonnes. They were shaped, dressed, in the archaeological vocabulary, to a specific profile, and they were erected in specific arrangements, and the whole was oriented in specific astronomical alignments that remain clearly visible and clearly intentional 4,000 years later. How did they move them? This is the question that the popular imagination has seized on most firmly, and it is a legitimate question. Moving a 25-ton stone 240 kilometres through the landscape of Neolithic Britain, across rivers, through forests, over hills, without wheeled vehicles, without metal tools, without draft animals larger than cattle. This is a genuine logistical achievement that should not be minimised. The current best understanding, based on a combination of physical experiments and archaeological evidence, involves large wooden sledges, long lines of people pulling with ropes, wooden rollers under the sledges in some circumstances, and wooden trackways over boggy ground. For the water portions of the journey, rafts or coracles. The evidence suggests that the stones were moved in stages, perhaps over many years, for the bluestone journey from Wales, with different communities taking responsibility for different sections of the route. But the more interesting question, the question that keeps me returning to Stonehenge, is not how, but why. Why this specific effort? Why carry stones 240 kilometers when there were perfectly good stones available locally? The answer to that question takes us somewhere that the mechanics of stone moving cannot reach: the Preseli Hills. The bluestones of Stonehenge are spotted dolerite and rhyolite and sandstone, outcropping from a specific part of the Preseli Hills in southwestern Wales. Recent archaeological work has identified the specific quarries where the stones were extracted, places called Carn Godog and Rosafillin, and has found evidence of Neolithic quarrying activity there, the specific wedge and lever technique of splitting the natural columns of stone from the bedrock. There is also evidence of human activity at these sites that predates the quarrying. Evidence suggesting that these specific outcrops were significant to the local people before anyone decided to move their stones to Salisbury Plain. Why were the Preseli Hills significant? The specific answer is not knowable with certainty, but the archaeology suggests that the hills were already a place of ceremony, possibly already associated with the dead or with the ancestors, before the stones began to move. Some of the most recent scholarship proposes that what was being moved was not merely stone, but sanctity, that the stones carried with them the specific significance of the place they came from, and that bringing those stones to Stonehenge was a way of bringing that significance to Salisbury Plain, of connecting the new monument to the sacred landscape of Wales. This interpretation, if it is correct, suggests something important about the minds of the people who built Stonehenge. They understood stones as carriers of meaning that was specific to the place from which the stones came. A stone from the Preseli Hills was not interchangeable with a stone from Salisbury Plain, even if they were physically similar, because the Preseli Hills stone carried with it the specific significance of the Preseli Hills. This is a sophisticated understanding of landscape and sacred geography, the understanding that specific places have specific qualities that adhere to the things that come from them. The Amesbury Archer. In 2002, archaeologists excavating a site near Amesbury, about 5 kilometers from Stonehenge, discovered a burial that has become one of the most significant archaeological finds in the study of Stonehenge's human context. The burial contained the remains of a man who died around 2300 BCE, around the time when the Sarsen stones were being erected at Stonehenge. He was buried with the richest collection of grave goods found in any early Bronze Age burial in Britain: copper knives, gold hair ornaments, the earliest gold objects found in Britain, flint arrowheads, boar's tusks, pottery vessels, wrist guards of the type used by archers, and more. The quantity and the quality of the grave goods suggest a person of exceptional status. Analysis of the enamel of his teeth, which preserves a chemical record of where a person grew up, showed that the Amesbury Archer did not grow up in Britain. His isotope signature is consistent with someone who grew up in the Alpine region of Central Europe, perhaps Switzerland or Austria. He was not a local man. He was a traveller from Central Europe who died near Stonehenge at the time when Stonehenge was becoming the monument we recognise, and who was buried with goods that suggest both extraordinary personal wealth and connections to the metalworking tradition of continental Europe. The Amesbury Archer is the specific human embodiment of something that the wider archaeological record of the period confirms. The Neolithic and early Bronze Age of Western Europe was not a collection of isolated local communities, each developing in isolation, unaware of the wider world. It was a connected world, a world in which people, ideas and objects moved across considerable distances, in which the communities that built Stonehenge were in contact, directly or through chains of exchange, with communities across the breadth of Europe, from Ireland to the Alps to Scandinavia to the Eastern Mediterranean. The Amber Road. The amber that gives this story one of its names is Baltic amber, the fossilized resin of ancient forests that is found in quantity along the shores of the Baltic Sea, particularly in what is now the Gdansk region of Poland and the Kaliningrad enclave and the coast of Jutland in Denmark. Baltic amber is chemically distinctive. When a piece of amber is subjected to specific spectroscopic analysis, it can be distinguished from other amber sources with considerable confidence, and Baltic amber appears in the Neolithic and Bronze Age in locations far from the Baltic. in Britain, in Ireland, in France, in the Rhineland, in the Mediterranean, in Egypt, in the Aegean. The amber necklaces found in British Bronze Age burials, spectacular objects, some of them hundreds of individual amber beads strung in complex patterns with spacer plates of amber that organized the beads into a broad collar, were made of Baltic amber. The amber found in the Mycenaean shaft graves at Mycenae, in the grave goods of people who died around 1500 BCE on the Greek mainland, was Baltic amber. The amber found in Bronze Age contexts in Denmark and northern Germany was the same material, from the same source, that somehow made its way to Britain and to Greece and to Egypt. This is the Amber Road. Not a single road in the modern sense, but a network of exchange relationships that moved amber from the Baltic coast southward through Central Europe to the Mediterranean and westward to Britain and Ireland, over the course of centuries and millennia, long before anyone wrote anything down. The specific mechanisms of this movement are invisible to us in detail. We cannot follow any individual piece of amber from the Baltic beach where it was collected to the burial in Britain or Greece where it was found, but the movement itself is documented in the distribution of chemically identified Baltic amber across the archaeological sites of prehistoric Europe. What did the amber move against? Exchange systems work by moving things in both directions. The amber went south and west, and something came north and east in return. The specific commodities that moved along the amber routes in the other direction are partly visible in the archaeological record and partly invisible. Bronze objects moved. The specific metalwork of the Alpine and Mediterranean bronze working traditions appears in northern European contexts in ways that suggest cultural exchange rather than independent development. Copper moved. The specific sources of the copper in northern European bronzes can sometimes be traced by chemical analysis to Alpine or Iberian sources. Ideas moved. The specific forms of metalwork, the decorative motifs, the burial practices that spread across Bronze Age Europe were not independently invented in each region but diffused, often along the same routes that the amber travelled. The people who moved these things. This is where the history becomes most difficult and most interesting. The Amber Road was maintained not by a single state or a single political authority, but by a chain of exchange relationships that connected people who may never have been more than 1 or 2 steps from their own home territory. The amber on the Baltic beach was collected by people who lived near the Baltic. They traded it perhaps to people in the Polish river valleys. Those people traded it to people in the Alpine foothills. Those people traded it to people in the Po Valley. Those people traded it to Mycenaean merchants, who traded it to Egyptian merchants, who brought it to the palace storerooms where archaeologists found it. At each stage in this chain, the amber changed hands. The person on the Baltic beach never saw Mycenae. The Mycenaean merchant never saw the Baltic, but the amber connected them, linked them in a chain of exchange that stretched across the breadth of the European continent, and that was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the prehistoric world. The communities along the Amber Road developed specific relationships with the commodities they handled, became specialists in the exchange, in the knowledge of what was available and what was wanted, in the specific practices of preserving and presenting the goods that maximized their value in exchange. The specific social position of the person who managed the amber trade in their local community was probably one of high status. The archaeological burials of Bronze Age intermediaries in the amber trade are often rich burials, people buried with goods from multiple directions, evidence of the specific wealth that controlling a position on a long-distance exchange network could produce. The Bush Barrow Man. About a kilometre from Stonehenge, in a burial mound called Bush Barrow that was excavated in 1808, archaeologists found the remains of a man buried around 1900 BCE with a collection of objects that is extraordinary by any standard. A large bronze dagger with a hilt decorated with thousands of tiny gold pins arranged in a geometric pattern, a technique of such refinement that modern craftspeople have had difficulty reproducing it. A large lozenge of sheet gold, decorated with geometric patterns, that was probably worn on the chest as a pectoral. A smaller lozenge of gold, a bronze axe, a stone mace head with a bone handle, a bronze dagger. This man was buried within sight of Stonehenge when Stonehenge was at the height of its development. The objects he was buried with were made with techniques of metalworking and goldsmithing that had no local precedent. They required skills and materials that connected their makers to the continental European bronze-working tradition. He was, in the specific sense that the objects suggest, someone who had access to the widest networks of exchange that the Bronze Age world of Western Europe could provide. We do not know his name. We do not know his title, or his role, or his relationship to Stonehenge. We know that he died around 1900 BCE and was buried with objects of extraordinary quality and unusual origin, and that the burial mound in which he lay was positioned within the visible horizon of Stonehenge. Whether he was a king, a priest, a merchant, a chieftain, a ritual specialist, these categories may not even have been distinct in the world he lived in. He was someone who mattered in the specific world that Stonehenge defined, and we know this only because of what he was buried with, the solar alignment. Stonehenge is aligned to the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. This alignment is precise and unambiguous. On the morning of the summer solstice, the rising sun appears directly above the heel stone when viewed from the center of the monument, and its light illuminates the altar stone at the center. On the evening of the winter solstice, the setting sun aligns with the main axis in the opposite direction. The alignment was not accidental. The monument was designed around these solar events, the architecture organized to make the specific astronomical moment visible and significant. What did the solstice alignment mean to the people who built and used Stonehenge? The specific answer is not knowable, but the structural answer suggests something important about their understanding of time. The solstice marks the turning of the year, the moment when the sun is at its northernmost or southernmost point on the horizon, when the days begin to lengthen or shorten. A monument that marks this turning is a monument that understands the year as a cycle, that understands the sun's movement as regular and predictable, that values the specific moment of turning as worthy of commemoration and perhaps of ceremony. The people who built Stonehenge were farmers. Their lives were organized around the agricultural year, the planting and the growing and the harvesting and the winter, and the solstice marked the specific hinge points of that year. A monument that made the solstice visible, that made the sun's turning tangible and communal and ceremonial, was a monument that connected the community to the cosmic cycle that their lives depended on. The farming year and the solar year were the same year, and Stonehenge made that connection visible in stone and light. The dead at Stonehenge. The cremation burials at Stonehenge span the monument's entire period of active use, from the earliest earthwork phase around 3000 BCE to the late Bronze Age around 1500 BCE. More than 200 individuals have been identified from the cremated bone found at the site, making Stonehenge one of the most significant cremation cemeteries in Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain. The analysis of these remains has yielded specific information. Most of the individuals buried at Stonehenge had chemical signatures consistent with having grown up in Wales or other regions of Western Britain, not from the Salisbury Plain area where the monument stands. Stonehenge attracted its dead from a wide area, suggesting that it functioned not merely as a local monument, but as a regional or perhaps supra-regional place of the dead, a place to which the dead were brought from considerable distances. Some of the cremated remains have been found to contain a specific isotope signature, consistent with having grown up in regions rich in a particular type of bedrock, the Preseli Hills region. The people brought to be buried at Stonehenge may have included people from Wales, the same region from which the bluestones were brought. If this interpretation is correct, then Stonehenge was connected to its stones homeland in a way that was more than architectural. The people who quarried the stones and the people who were buried among those stones may have been connected by the same cultural tradition, the same understanding of those specific hills as a place of significance. This is the specific human complexity that the archaeology of Stonehenge is slowly revealing. Not a monument built by one community in one place for one purpose in one generation, but a monument that accumulated meaning over 1500 years, that was connected to landscapes and communities across the breadth of prehistoric Britain, that served as a gathering place for the living and a resting place for the dead from a wide and complex world, the Neolithic world of Britain. To understand Stonehenge, you need to understand something about the world in which it was built. The Neolithic period in Britain began around 4000 BCE with the arrival of farming, the specific agricultural revolution that transformed Britain from a landscape of hunter-gatherers to a landscape of farmers. The farmers who arrived brought cattle and sheep and pigs, wheat and barley, the specific domestic animals and cultivated plants that constituted the Neolithic agricultural toolkit. They also brought, apparently, the specific architectural tradition of the long barrow, the earthen mound covering a stone chamber for the communal burial of the dead, that is one of the most distinctive features of the Neolithic landscape of Britain. The long barrows of Neolithic Britain, Wayland Smithy, West Kennet, Hetty Pegler's Tump, Bella Snap, and dozens of others are the monuments of communities that understood themselves in relationship to their dead in a specific way. The dead were not buried once and left. They were returned to. The chambers were reopened, bones were moved and rearranged. Sometimes the bones of individuals were separated, and particular bones, skulls, long bones, were moved to specific positions within the chamber. The dead were active participants in the life of the community in a very specific material sense. Their physical remains were managed, their bones were curated, they were placed and displaced and repositioned in ways that suggest an ongoing relationship between the living community and its dead. Stonehenge emerged from this world. It was built by communities that had been interacting with their dead in this active, material way for 1,000 years before the first stones were erected. The cremation burials that are the earliest human remains at Stonehenge are the continuation of this tradition in a different form. The dead coming to a new kind of monument, a monument that was defined not by the structure of a chamber, but by the specific astronomical alignments and the specific stone arrangements that the Neolithic and Bronze Age builders created, the cursus. To the north of Stonehenge runs a feature called the Stonehenge Cursus, a long, parallel-sided earthwork enclosure about 3 kilometers long and 100 meters wide, built around 3500 BCE, predating Stonehenge itself by several centuries. The cursus is not well understood, its function is unknown, its relationship to Stonehenge is unclear. It is simply there, in the landscape, enormous and apparently deliberate, one of several large earthwork features of the Neolithic landscape that remind us how much construction was happening in this area over thousands of years, how many communities were investing labour and intention in transforming this specific piece of the Salisbury Plain landscape. The cursus is a reminder that Stonehenge was not built in an empty landscape. It was built in a landscape that was already filled with monuments, already marked with the traces of previous communities' investment and ceremony and burial. The people who began the earliest phase of Stonehenge around 3000 BCE were not starting from nothing. They were adding to a landscape that already had meaning, a landscape that had been shaped by human intention for centuries. Avebury. 17 miles north of Stonehenge stands the other great monument of the Neolithic Wiltshire landscape, Avebury. If Stonehenge is the more architecturally precise monument, the specific astronomical alignments, the carefully dressed sarsen stones, Avebury is the larger. The stone circle at Avebury is the largest in the world. Its outer circle has a diameter of about 330 meters. Stonehenge, by comparison, has a diameter of about 30 meters. The monument includes not just the outer circle, but several inner circles and an enormous earthwork bank and ditch that encloses the stones, and 2 long avenues of paired standing stones that led to it from the south and west. Avebury was built beginning around 2050 BCE, roughly contemporary with the beginning of the earthwork phase at Stonehenge, and it continued to be modified and added to over the following centuries. The relationship between Avebury and Stonehenge is one of the most discussed questions in the archaeology of the Wiltshire landscape, whether they serve different purposes, different communities, different aspects of the same ritual tradition, or whether they were part of a single, interconnected sacred landscape. The honest answer is that we don't know with confidence, but the landscape between them, the ridgeway, the river valleys, the network of pathways through the chalk downs, was populated with monuments and burials and earthworks that suggest a dense and deliberately organised sacred geography across the whole of the region. The Durrington Walls settlement, about 2 miles northeast of Stonehenge, adjacent to the River Avon, the site called Durrington Walls was, around 2500 BCE, one of the largest known Neolithic settlements in Britain. The settlement, which has been excavated extensively, shows evidence of large numbers of people gathered together in a relatively short period. The animal bones found at the site are consistent with feasting on a significant scale, and the style of the structures suggests temporary or seasonal occupation rather than permanent settlement. The pottery and the food remains suggest that people came to this site, feasted, and left. The archaeological interpretation is that Durrington Walls was a gathering site for the communities who were building Stonehenge or participating in the ceremonies at Stonehenge in the period when the Sarsen stones were being erected. They came for the specific occasion, they feasted, they participated in whatever ceremonies the occasion required, and then they returned to wherever they had come from. The scale of the feasting evidence, the number of cattle and pigs consumed, the amount of pottery used and discarded, suggests that hundreds or perhaps thousands of people participated in these gatherings. This is the specific social reality of Stonehenge that the archaeology reveals. It was not built or used by a small local community. It was a monument of regional significance, a place to which people came from across a wide area for specific occasions, a focal point for the social and religious life of a much larger community than any single village or farmstead could constitute. The logistical effort of building Stonehenge was possible precisely because it was a shared project, because the communities of Neolithic and early Bronze Age Britain understood themselves as connected to each other in ways that could mobilize collective labor across considerable distances. The person on the beach. I want to give you a specific moment, as specific as I can make it from the evidence, to bring the Amber Road and the monument builders into human scale. Imagine the Baltic coast, somewhere in what is now the Gdansk region of Poland, around 1500 BCE. A woman is walking on the beach in the autumn after a storm. The storms wash amber ashore, and she is looking for it. Pieces of the golden resin that the forest long since buried, uncovered by the waves, tumbled onto the sand in shapes that range from gravel-sized fragments to pieces the size of her fist. She knows what amber is worth. She has been trading in amber since she was old enough to understand exchange, and her family before her has traded in it for generations. She knows which pieces are most valuable, the clearest, the most golden, the ones without inclusions, and she picks them with the practiced eye of someone for whom this knowledge is as natural as reading the weather. She does not know what happens to the amber after it leaves her hands. She trades it to the people who come from the south in exchange for bronze objects and perhaps for other goods, and those people take it south to other traders, and eventually the amber arrives somewhere she has never been and will never go. The woman with the best amber ornaments in Mycenae, the Egyptian courtier with the amber beads in her collar, the chieftain on Salisbury Plain buried with an amber cup. These people are as remote from the woman on the Baltic beach as the stars. She does not know about Stonehenge. She has never heard of Egypt. She knows about amber, and about the people who want it, and about the exchange that gives her access to the metal objects that make her community's tools and weapons. She finds a good piece, clear, the colour of honey, about the size of her palm. She holds it up to the light, the autumn Baltic light that comes low and gold across the water, and it glows from within, warm and deep, the specific colour that no other material in the prehistoric world could produce. She puts it in the bag at her belt and continues down the beach. That piece of amber, or something like it, might be in a museum somewhere today. Analysed and catalogued, its Baltic origin confirmed by spectroscopy, its Bronze Age context established by the burial or the hoard in which it was found. She is not in the museum. She has no name in the record, no grave we can identify with confidence, no object we can point to and say, this was hers. But she was there, doing this work, making possible the chain of exchange that connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean, that filled the grave goods of Mycenaean kings with amber from her beach. The monument builders, the people who quarried the bluestones in the Preseli Hills, who moved them across Wales and the Bristol Channel and the Salisbury Plain, who erected them in the specific arrangements that the monument required. These people are similarly almost invisible to us. We know they existed because the monument exists. We know something about their technology from the evidence of the quarries and the experimental archaeology that has tested different methods of stone transport. We know something about their diet and their health from the bones found at Durrington Walls and in the barrows of the period. We know something about their connection to the wider world from the amber and the metals and the distant stones that arrived at Stonehenge. What we don't know is what they thought, what the monument meant to them, what ceremonies they performed there, what stories they told about why the stones came from Wales, what the solstice sunrise meant in the framework of their understanding of the world. All of this is beyond our reach because they left no words. The interpretation of Stonehenge is, in a very specific sense, always going to be partial, because the people who made it and used it cannot speak to us. But the monument itself speaks, not in words, but in the specific language of stone and alignment and effort and accumulated meaning. It says, "We were here." It says, "We understood the sky and the year and the turning of the seasons." It says, "We cared enough about our dead to bring them from Wales and to bury them here. And we cared enough about this place to carry 25-ton stones 30 kilometers to stand in specific arrangements." It says, "We were connected to people and places far beyond what we could see from this hill." It says, "We were building something that would last. 4,500 years later, it is still lasting." The abandonment. Sometime around 1500 BCE, Stonehenge seems to have been modified for the last time, and then left largely unchanged. The active construction of the monument, the moving and the erecting of new stones, the digging of new features, appears to have stopped. The site was not abandoned in the sense that people stopped visiting it. The archaeological record suggests continued activity at the site through the Late Bronze Age and into the Iron Age. But the monument itself, as an architectural project, was complete. Why did the construction stop? The honest answer is that we don't know. The communities that had built Stonehenge continued to exist, continued to farm the Wiltshire landscape, continued to participate in the networks of exchange that had connected them to the wider Bronze Age world. But whatever the social and religious need that had driven the construction of Stonehenge for 1500 years had apparently been met, or had changed, or had been transferred to different kinds of monuments, or different kinds of practice. This is one of the things about Stonehenge that I find most difficult to convey adequately. Not the building of it, which is extraordinary, but the specific relationship that a society maintains with a monument over 1500 years of active use, and the specific moment when that relationship changes. The communities that used Stonehenge in 1500 BCE were not the communities that began the monument in 3000 BCE. They were separated by 50 generations, by as much time as separates us from the early medieval period, from the time of Charlemagne and Beowulf. Over 50 generations, the monument was maintained, was modified, was added to, was used. The specific understanding of what Stonehenge was and what it was for probably changed enormously over those 15 centuries. Accumulated new layers of meaning, shed old ones, was reinterpreted by each generation in the light of its own concerns and its own cosmology. What remained constant, apparently, was the monument's importance. Whatever changed in the understanding of Stonehenge over 1500 years of use, what did not change was the commitment to maintain it, to add to it, to use it. 15 centuries of importance is an extraordinary thing for any human institution to achieve. The Catholic Church is only 2,000 years old. The Chinese examination system lasted about 1,300 years. Stonehenge was actively significant to the communities that used it for longer than most human institutions have existed. The stones today, they are still there. 4,500 years have passed since the first stones were erected, and some of them are still standing, and some are fallen, and some are gone entirely, removed in the medieval period, carted away for building material, lost to the specific small-scale pragmatism that has always been the monument's greatest threat. But enough remains that the alignment still works. On the morning of the summer solstice, the rising sun still comes up over the heel stone, and the light still moves into the center of the monument in the way that the builders intended. Every year, at the summer solstice, people gather at Stonehenge to watch the sun rise. The specific communities that built and used Stonehenge are gone. Their language is gone. Their religion is gone. Their social organization, their names, their stories, their understanding of what the solstice meant and why a stone from Wales was different from a stone from Wiltshire. All of this is gone, dissolved in the 4,500 years that have passed since the monument was built. But the sun still rises over the heel stone, and there are still people there to watch it. I don't know what the builders would think of this, of the crowds that gather at the summer solstice in costumes that have no connection to the Neolithic world, of the specific modern reverence that attaches itself to the monument's ancient authority. Perhaps they would recognize something in it. Perhaps they would be completely baffled. The monument they built was built for a world that has entirely ceased to exist. And yet here it is, still standing, still aligned, still doing the specific thing it was built to do, marking the turning of the sun in the specific place on the Salisbury Plain where someone, 4,500 years ago, decided that the turning of the sun was worth marking. She was on the beach, picking up amber. He was in the grave with his gold. They were quarrying the spotted dolerite from the Presely Hills, wedging and levering and splitting the stone. They were pulling the stones across the landscape on their sledges, through the cold British winters, toward the hill on the plain where the monument was taking shape. They were feasting at Durrington Walls after the day's work, the fires burning, the cattle roasting, the specific warmth of a great communal gathering at the end of a long day of collective effort. They left no letters, but they left this. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me go deeper into the world that produced Stonehenge, because I have given you the monument and the exchange network and the specific individuals whose graves we have found, but I have not given you the texture of daily life in Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain, what it felt like to be a farmer on the Salisbury Plain in 2500 BCE, what the landscape looked like and sounded like and smelled like, what organised the days and the seasons of the people who built these extraordinary things, the farming. The Neolithic farmers of Britain were cereal farmers, wheat and barley, and pastoralists who kept cattle and sheep and pigs. The specific technology of Neolithic farming was relatively simple: stone-tipped ards for breaking the soil, hand harvesting of grain, the grinding of grain in saddle querns to produce flour. But simple technology does not mean simple knowledge. The Neolithic farmers' knowledge of the land, of which soils would grow which crops, of which areas flooded in wet years and which dried out in drought, of the specific timing of the agricultural cycle that the local climate and the local topography required, was extensive and detailed and accumulated over generations. The cattle. Of all the animals that the Neolithic communities of Britain kept, cattle were the most important, not primarily as food, though they provided both meat and milk, but as the primary form of the wealth that organised social relations. In many pre-monetary economies, cattle are the specific medium of value, the thing you give at a wedding, the thing you pay as compensation for an injury, the thing you slaughter at a feast to demonstrate your generosity and your abundance. The size of a person's herd was a direct index of their social standing, and the management and increase of the herd was one of the primary activities around which social life organised itself. The cattle bones at Durrington Walls, the Neolithic feasting site near Stonehenge, show specific patterns that are consistent with this understanding. The cattle were predominantly young adults, killed in the autumn or winter, when they would have been at their best condition after the summer's grazing. The specific teeth of the cattle and the specific bones that survive show that many of the animals were brought from some distance. The isotope signatures suggest that cattle arrived from different regions for the feasting events at Durrington Walls. People brought their cattle from a wide area to feast at the monument site. This is not an economy of subsistence, it is an economy of ceremony, in which the specific wealth of the community is made visible and shared at the specific moment of the gathering. The chalk landscape. The Salisbury Plain and the downs of Wiltshire and Dorset are chalk, porous, well-drained, fertile on the surface but lacking surface water in many areas. The Neolithic farmers who settled here had to manage their water supply with care, and the rivers, the Avon, the Wylye, the Nadder, were the organising features of the landscape that determined where settlements could be. The chalk uplands between the rivers were good for grazing and could be cultivated with effort, but the rivers were essential. The chalk of the Salisbury Plain has a specific property that makes it an extraordinary archive of prehistoric activity. It preserves, in its surface, the traces of human activity in the form of soil marks, crop marks, and earthworks that remain visible thousands of years after the activity that produced them. From the air, the Wiltshire landscape reveals itself as one of the most densely marked prehistoric landscapes in the world, a palimpsest of Neolithic and Bronze Age earthworks, barrows, enclosures, field systems, and trackways that tells us, in the specific language of altered ground, about millennia of human occupation and ceremony and agriculture. The henges. Stonehenge is one of many henges, a specific type of Neolithic monument consisting of a circular or near-circular bank with an interior ditch, usually with one or more entrances. The ditch, being on the inside of the bank, is one of the diagnostic features of the henge type, distinguishing it from enclosures that were designed for defence, where the ditch would be outside the bank. This inversion suggests that henges were not defensive structures. The bank and ditch were not designed to keep anything out or in, but to define a boundary, to create a specific enclosed space that was different from the landscape outside it. Sacred space, in archaeological language, though that phrase covers a very wide range of specific human activities and understandings. The Wiltshire landscape contains Avebury, Stonehenge, Marden, and Durrington walls, 4 of the largest henges in Britain, all within a relatively compact area of Wiltshire. This clustering is not random. The specific concentration of monumental architecture in this area of Wiltshire over the Neolithic and early Bronze Age period suggests that this was a landscape of exceptional religious and social significance, a landscape that attracted investment and ceremony, and the presence of the dead and the gathering of the living from a wide surrounding area. The flint. Before the coming of metal, before the copper and bronze that characterized the Bronze Age, the primary tool-making material of Neolithic Britain was flint. The chalk of the Wiltshire Downs contains flint in abundance, and the Neolithic knappers who worked it achieved a technical mastery that remains remarkable to anyone who has tried to replicate it. The leaf-shaped arrowheads, the polished stone axes, the scrapers and knives and borers of the Neolithic toolkit, these were made with a precision and a skill that required years of practice to develop, that was learnt from experienced practitioners and passed from generation to generation as a specific form of technical knowledge. The flint mines of Grimes Graves in Norfolk, where Neolithic miners sank shafts 30 feet into the chalk to reach the best quality flint, the specific preferred material for the finest tools, are one of the most remarkable industrial sites of the Neolithic world. The miners left tools at the bottom of the shafts, offerings perhaps, or simply the objects they had finished with. They left chalk carvings. They left the specific traces of minds that understood their work as something more than merely practical. The passage of the seasons. For the farming communities of Neolithic Britain, the year was organised around the agricultural cycle in a way that is difficult for a modern person to fully appreciate, not because we don't know that farming is seasonal, but because we no longer experience the specific urgency that agricultural necessity imposed on every decision. The timing of planting was not a preference, but a necessity. Plant too early, and the last frost kills the seedlings. Plant too late, and the harvest cannot be completed before the autumn rains. The timing of the harvest was equally urgent, the management of the animals through the winter, deciding which to slaughter in the autumn and which to keep alive, calculating whether there was enough fodder for the survivors, was a calculation that had direct consequences for whether the community would be hungry in the spring. In this context, the specific astronomical knowledge embedded in Stonehenge's design is not a luxury or an intellectual exercise. It is practical information. Knowing when the solstice occurs tells you where you are in the year with precision. The solstice is the turning point, the moment from which the days begin to lengthen or shorten, the moment that tells the farmer how many days remain before spring or winter. A monument that marks the solstice with architectural precision is, among other things, a calendar of extraordinary accuracy and permanence. The journey to the monument. For many of the people who participated in the ceremonies at Stonehenge, getting there was itself a significant journey. The communities of Neolithic and Bronze Age Wiltshire lived in scattered farmsteads and small settlements across the landscape, connected by the trackways that followed the ridges of the chalk downs. For people in more distant parts of Britain, in Wales, in the north, in Ireland, the journey to Stonehenge might have taken days or weeks, a significant investment of time and effort that was itself part of the ceremonial significance of the visit. The River Avon, which runs close to Stonehenge on its eastern side, was probably a route for the final approach, the procession up the river and then along the ceremonial avenue that connected the river to the monument. The West Kennet Avenue at Avebury, 2 miles of paired standing stones leading to the Great Circle, gives us a sense of what ceremonial approaches to these monuments looked like. Not a simple path to an entrance, but a defined corridor that organised movement through the landscape, that created a specific transition from the ordinary world to the sacred space of the monument. The women. The skeletal remains from the barrows and burial sites associated with Stonehenge include women and children as well as men. The grave goods of some of the women's burials are rich: amber beads, jet ornaments, bronze objects, the specific markers of status that the Bronze Age used. The women of Bronze Age Wiltshire were not ornamental. They were farmers and craftspeople and traders and managers of households and estates. and some of them were buried with goods that suggest positions of considerable social standing. The isotope analysis of the Stonehenge cremation burials has shown that the dead who were brought to Stonehenge from Wales and other distant regions included women. The monument attracted its dead from both sexes and from wide geographical areas. Whatever Stonehenge was, whatever ceremony it hosted, whatever significance it held, it was not exclusively a male space or a space of warrior status. It was a place of the dead, of the community's dead, and the community included everyone. The forest. The landscape of Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain was more forested than it is now, but less than it had been in the Mesolithic period before farming. The Neolithic clearance of forest for farmland was one of the most significant transformations of the British landscape, a process that began around 4000 BCE and continued for millennia. The chalk downs of Wiltshire, which are today an open, rolling landscape of grass and cultivation, were partly forested in the Neolithic. The specific mix of woodland and clearing and pasture that Neolithic farming produced was different from both the wildwood it replaced and the agricultural landscape that eventually succeeded it. The clearing of forest for farmland was not purely pragmatic. The trees had meaning in the Neolithic world. Specific trees, specific groves, specific woodland spaces were significant in ways that the archaeology can only partially recover. The post holes found at several Neolithic sites suggest that timber monuments, wooden henges, wooden circles, wooden avenues preceded or accompanied the stone monuments, and were sometimes of considerable scale. Woodhenge, just 2 miles from Stonehenge, was a monument of timber posts arranged in concentric ovals, the posts so large that they must have been visible at considerable distance. The timber and the stone traditions of Neolithic Britain coexisted and sometimes shared the same site. The boats. The bluestones of Stonehenge were moved at some point in their journey from Wales to Salisbury Plain across water. The most likely route takes the stones from the Priestley Hills to the Welsh coast, across the Bristol Channel. A significant sea crossing, even in relatively calm weather, along the Somerset coast and up the River Avon towards Salisbury Plain. This route is not confirmed with certainty, but it is consistent with the geography and with the evidence of what was possible with Neolithic watercraft. The boats that made this crossing were dugout canoes and skin-covered vessels, chronicles and currachs, that the Neolithic and Bronze Age peoples of Britain and Ireland used for coastal and riverine travel. These boats were smaller than the Mediterranean trading vessels of the late Bronze Age, and they were not designed for open ocean voyaging. But the Bristol Channel, while not sheltered, is not the open ocean, and the crossing at its narrowest is manageable in favourable conditions. The specific logistics of moving very heavy stones by water, the use of rafts, of multiple boats lashed together, of tidal assistance, of careful choice of crossing conditions, remain partly speculative, but the evidence of the stones themselves shows that the crossing was made. The astronomical knowledge. The solstice alignment of Stonehenge is the most visible expression of the astronomical knowledge of its builders, but it is not the only one. The monument incorporates alignments to other astronomical events, the lunar standstill, the rising and setting of specific stars, that suggest a comprehensive knowledge of the sky and its cycles. The specific people who managed this knowledge, who tracked the movements of the sun and moon and stars, who knew when the solstices and equinoxes and lunar standstills would occur, who maintained the specific calculations over years and decades, were specialists. People whose specific role in the community was to maintain this knowledge and to use it in the context of the ceremonies that the calendar required. This specialization, the existence of people whose specific social role was the management of astronomical knowledge, suggests a level of social complexity in Neolithic Britain that the popular imagination often underestimates. These were not simple farming communities living hand-to-mouth, uninterested in anything beyond the next harvest. They were communities that could afford to maintain specialists, people who spent significant time on activities that were not directly agricultural, who accumulated knowledge that was transmitted from generation to generation, who exercised authority in the specific domain of the calendar and the sky. The Bell Beaker people. Around 2500 BCE, as the sarsen stones were being erected at Stonehenge, a significant change is visible in the archaeological record of Britain. The appearance of a new style of pottery, the bell beaker, and associated burial practices and material culture. The bell beaker tradition originated in the Iberian Peninsula and spread rapidly across Western Europe, reaching Britain around 2500 BCE and apparently bringing with it, or being associated with, significant genetic changes in the population. Recent ancient DNA analysis has shown that the arrival of the bell beaker culture in Britain was associated with a large-scale population replacement. Within a few generations, the genetic ancestry of the British population shifted dramatically toward the steppe-derived ancestry that characterizes the bell beaker-associated populations of continental Europe. This is one of the most dramatic findings of recent ancient DNA research, and it raises specific questions about the relationship between the Stonehenge of the early phases, built by the Neolithic farming population, and the Stonehenge of the Sarsen phase, built during or after the arrival of the bell beaker-associated population. Were the people who erected the Sarsens the descendants of the people who built the earthwork, or were they a largely new population, perhaps one that arrived with the bell beaker tradition and adopted the existing monument, bringing their own understanding of what it meant? The honest answer is that we don't know. The monument was built over such a long period, and the population change was apparently so significant that the relationship between the different building phases and the different populations is genuinely uncertain. What we can say is that whoever erected the Sarsens valued the site that had already been established, chose to build on it and develop it rather than abandoning it, and incorporated the existing astronomical alignments into the new construction. The solstice orientation, which the early earthwork may have already embodied, was preserved and made more precise in the Sarsen phase. Whatever the bell beaker people thought Stonehenge was for, whatever they brought with them from their continental origins in terms of cosmology and ceremony, they recognized in this place on Salisbury Plain something worth developing. They brought the Sarsens from Marlborough Downs. They built the trilithons. They created the monument that stands today, the specific quiet of the monument before dawn. I want to end by giving you a specific moment, not historical, but imaginative, because the imagination is sometimes the only way to reach across the 4,500 years that separate us from the builders. It is the morning of the summer solstice, sometime around 2000 BCE. The monument is complete, or nearly complete, in one of its phases. The sky is beginning to lighten in the northeast, the specific direction from which the midsummer sunrise comes. The people who have gathered for this occasion, the farmers of the surrounding area, the travellers who have come from further, the dead who lie in the barrows on the surrounding hillside, are gathered within the monument or around it. The specific ceremonies that mark the occasion have been conducted through the night, perhaps, or are about to begin with the dawn. The light comes. It comes over the heel stone first, the specific outlying stone that catches the sunrise before the monument. Then it enters the main circle, moving along the axis that the builders designed, toward the altar stone at the centre. For a few minutes, the sun and the monument are aligned in the way that 15 centuries of building were meant to produce. We do not know what was said at this moment. We do not know what was done. We do not know the specific words or the specific gestures or the specific beliefs that framed this alignment as sacred. We know only that the alignment exists, that it was built deliberately, and that for 15 centuries people came here at this moment. The amber on the beach is still honey golden in the light. The bluestones still came from Wales. The dead are still in the barrows, and the living are still standing among the stones. And the sun is still doing what the builders of Stonehenge knew it would do, rising on this morning in exactly this direction. They left no letters. They left this instead. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me take you to the wider Bronze Age world of which Stonehenge was a part, because the monument does not stand alone in its historical context. It is connected by the Amber Road, by the exchange of metals, by the movement of people like the Amesbury Archer, to a world that extended far beyond the Salisbury Plain, and giving you that world gives you Stonehenge in its full dimension, the Bronze Age of Scandinavia. In the same period when the Sarsens were being erected at Stonehenge, Scandinavia was developing one of the richest and most distinct Bronze Age cultures in the world. The Scandinavian Bronze Age, which spans roughly 1700 to 500 BCE, is characterized by extraordinary metalwork, the long spiral bronze trumpets called lyres, the elaborate bronze razors and fibulae, the spectacular gold sun discs and sunships, and by rock carvings, petroglyphs pecked into the bedrock of coastal Scandinavian sites that depict ships and warriors and animals and the sun in ways that give us a partial window into the cosmological understanding of the people who made them. The Scandinavian Bronze Age was built on amber. The amber of the Baltic coast was Scandinavia's primary export commodity, the specific natural resource that gave Scandinavian communities access to the bronze and gold that they could not produce locally. The Danish Bronze Age graves, many of them preserved with extraordinary completeness by the specific chemistry of the Danish bogs, which are as effective at preservation as the Egyptian desert, contain objects of astonishing quality and variety. The Egtved girl, buried around 1370 BCE in a coffin of oak, her clothes and personal ornaments intact, a bucket of fermented drink beside her. The Borum Eshoi man in his oak coffin, his wool clothing and his comb and his razor and his belt, still present after 3,500 years. The Egtved girl is worth dwelling on, because she is one of the most vividly preserved individuals from the Bronze Age world. She was young when she died, probably between 16 and 18 years old, and she was buried in a hollow oak trunk, her coffin sealed and preserved by the specific anaerobic chemistry of the bog. The isotope analysis of her teeth and hair shows that she grew up in the Black Forest region of southwestern Germany, not in Denmark. She had travelled a long distance from her origin to where she died. She was wearing a short woolen skirt, a blouse with three-quarter sleeves, and bronze earrings and an elaborate bronze belt plate. She was buried with the remains of a young child at her feet, the burned bones of the child wrapped in cloth. Beside her was a small bucket that contained the remains of a fermented drink made of wheat, bog myrtle, cranberry, and honey. Who was she? Why did she travel from the Black Forest to Denmark? What was the specific occasion of her burial? Was she a bride who had travelled to marry a Danish chieftain? Was she a priestess or a ritual specialist? Was she a merchant's daughter? Was she a slave? The archaeology cannot tell us. The isotope analysis tells us that she travelled. The burial goods tell us that she was significant. The child at her feet raises questions that we cannot answer. She is a person from the Bronze Age world, specific and individual, and irreducibly unknown. The British Bronze Age and the metal trade. By 2000 BCE, Britain was producing its own bronze, the specific alloy of copper and tin that characterises the Bronze Age, using copper from the mines of Wales and Ireland and, in some periods, imported copper from the continent. The tin that completed the alloy came from the tin-bearing deposits of Cornwall in southwestern Britain, which were among the most important tin sources in the prehistoric world. The specific connection between Cornish tin and the Mediterranean bronze-working tradition is one of the more discussed questions in Bronze Age archaeology. Whether the Phoenicians or other Mediterranean traders came directly to Cornwall for tin, or whether the tin reached the Mediterranean through the same chain of inland exchange that moved amber in the other direction. The Bronze Age mines of Wales, the Great Orme copper mine on the North Welsh coast, where Neolithic and Bronze Age workings have been extensively excavated, give us a direct view into the specific labour of prehistoric mining. The mine was worked with stone tools, with bone and antler picks, with the specific technique of lighting fires against the rock face and then quenching them with water to crack the rock. The mine tunnels are narrow, in some places too narrow for an adult to stand. The miners crawled through the darkness with their stone tools, following the veins of malachite, the specific copper ore, deeper into the hill. The tools found in the mine include objects of a size consistent with being used by children, which suggests that children worked in the mine as well as adults, their smaller bodies able to access the tunnels that adults could not reach. This is the specific human cost of the Bronze Age's technological achievement. The bronze objects of the period, the weapons and the tools and the ornaments that made the Bronze Age what it was, were possible because of the labour of people in mines in Wales and Ireland and the Alps. People whose specific work in specific dark and narrow spaces produced the copper and the tin that the rest of the Bronze Age world needed. The beautiful bronze dagger from the Bush Barrow burial, with its thousands of tiny gold pins, was made possible by the children in the tunnels of the Great Orme. The stone circles of Britain. Stonehenge is the most famous, but it is far from the only stone circle in Britain and Ireland. There are more than 1,000 stone circles in the British Isles, some large, some small, some elaborate and some simple, scattered from Orkney in the far north to the tip of Cornwall in the southwest, from the west coast of Ireland to the east coast of Scotland. The tradition of building stone circles spans the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, from roughly 3000 BCE to 1500 BCE. and the circles serve, or were associated with, a wide variety of purposes: burial, ceremony, astronomical observation, gathering, the specific functions that communities invested in their monumental architecture. The Ring of Brodgar in Orkney, a stone circle of 60 or so original stones, 27 survive, on a peninsula between two lochs, is contemporary with the earliest phases of Stonehenge. It is part of the Neolithic heart of Orkney, a cluster of Neolithic monuments including the stones of Stenness, the great burial mound of Maeshowe, and the settlement of Skara Brae, that makes Orkney one of the most extraordinary concentrations of Neolithic archaeology in the world. The specific isolation of Orkney, its distance from the main centres of population in southern Britain, means that the Neolithic communities of the islands were developing their monumental tradition in parallel with, but not necessarily in direct contact with, the communities of Wiltshire. Yet the traditions are recognisably related. The same types of pottery, the same types of monuments, the same specific understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead that organised the Neolithic world of the British Isles. Skara Brae. The Neolithic settlement preserved under the sand dunes of Orkney since around 2500 BCE gives us the most complete picture of Neolithic domestic life in Britain. The stone houses of Skara Brae, built of the abundant Orcadian flagstone that splits into flat slabs perfectly suited for construction, are preserved to their full height in some cases, the stone furniture intact, the stone dressers, the stone beds, the stone hearths. The people who lived in these houses lived in a world that was materially comfortable by Neolithic standards. They had adequate food, well-constructed housing, the specific social connections that the exchange of pottery and stone tools reveals. What were they thinking about? The specific beliefs and the specific cosmology of the Neolithic communities of Orkney are partially visible in the careful alignment of their monuments. Maeshowe is aligned to the midwinter sunset, its chamber illuminated by the setting sun on the winter solstice in a way that is clearly intentional, and in the specific treatment of their dead who were buried in the communal chambers of the cairns with the care and the deliberateness that suggests an active relationship between the living community and its dead. But the specific content of their beliefs, the names of their gods, if they had gods, the stories they told about the creation of the world or the meaning of death, is inaccessible. The Irish gold. Ireland in the Bronze Age was one of the richest sources of gold in the prehistoric world. The gold that came from the rivers and the alluvial deposits of Irish geology was worked into the extraordinary objects that make the Bronze Age gold of Ireland among the most spectacular prehistoric metalwork in the world. The sun discs of sheet gold, the crescent-shaped lunulae that were worn around the neck, the elaborate twisted rod torques, the specific objects of personal ornament that moved through the exchange networks of Bronze Age Europe, appearing in Brittany and in Britain and in Scandinavia. The Irish gold tradition is closely connected to the Amber Road in the sense that both represent the movement of specific natural materials of unusual beauty and rarity through the prehistoric exchange networks of Europe. The gold from Ireland and the amber from the Baltic were the two primary luxury materials of prehistoric Europe in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, and they moved in complementary directions, the amber moving south and west, the gold moving north and east, through the same chain of exchange relationships. The person who had amber in the Bronze Age was likely also the person who had access to gold, because the networks that moved one material moved the other. The chalk figures on the hillsides of southern England, cut into the chalk that underlies the thin turf of the downs, are figures that have been maintained, the chalk excavated and refreshed periodically for centuries. The most famous is the White Horse of Uffington, cut into the chalk hill above the Vale of White Horse in Oxfordshire. A stylized figure of a horse about 110 metres long that has been maintained since at least the first millennium BCE. The specific stylization of the Uffington horse, the spare, elegant lines, the sense of movement, is one of the most beautiful examples of prehistoric art in Britain. The chalk figures connect the prehistoric landscape to the visible landscape of the present in a specific way that the stone monuments do not quite manage. You can see the Uffington horse from the air, from the ridgeway track above it, from the valley below it, and the specific vision of the prehistoric, the sense of the Bronze Age people shaping the landscape to be seen, creating a figure that required ongoing communal maintenance to remain visible, is more immediate there than it is at any stone monument. The stone monuments are permanent. The chalk figure is maintained by continuing human effort. To see the white horse is to see not just the original act of creation, but all the subsequent acts of maintenance, the periodic recutting, the clearing of the turf that have kept it visible for 3,000 years, the end of the Bronze Age. Around 800 BCE, the Bronze Age of Britain and Europe came to an end. Not abruptly, not catastrophically in the way that the collapse of the Mycenaean world had been, but as a gradual transition to the Iron Age, in which iron replaced bronze as the primary metal for tools and weapons, and the specific social and economic structures that the bronze trade had sustained were replaced by different structures suited to the different requirements of iron technology. The transition to iron was, in the specific case of Britain and Northern Europe, a somewhat different process than it had been in the Mediterranean world. The Mediterranean Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BCE had been a sudden disruption, the palace economies destroyed, the trade networks severed, the specific systems that had sustained the late Bronze Age world suddenly failing. In Britain and Northern Europe, the transition from Bronze to Iron Age was slower and less catastrophic, a gradual shift in the relative importance of different materials and different exchange networks, rather than a sudden collapse. What the Iron Age meant for the monuments. Stonehenge was not abandoned in the Iron Age. People continued to visit it, continued to use it for some purposes, continued to deposit objects in its vicinity. But the active construction of the monument had ceased long before, and the Iron Age communities of Wiltshire were not adding new stones or building new features at Stonehenge. The monument became, in the Iron Age, what it has been for most of its subsequent history, a place that was old, that was the work of people from a different time, that carried a specific authority because of its age and its scale and its visible astronomical alignments, without being actively maintained or added to. This transition from active monument to ancient monument is one of the most interesting changes in Stonehenge's long history. At some point, the people who used the monument stopped being the people who built it. They were using something they had inherited, something whose specific original purposes they may have understood incompletely or not at all. The authority of Stonehenge became, from this point, the authority of the ancient, the specific weight that attaches to things that are older than living memory, that seem to reach back into a time before the present world. The Druids did not build Stonehenge. The Celts, who were the Iron Age population of Britain, arrived in Britain long after Stonehenge's construction was complete. The specific association of Stonehenge with Druids, the priestly class of the Celtic world, was not made until the early modern period, when antiquarians like John Aubrey began to look at Stonehenge and speculate about who had built it. The Druids did not build it, but they may well have used it. The authority of the ancient monument was available to whoever wanted to invoke it, and the Celtic tradition of sacred sites and sacred landscapes would have recognized Stonehenge as a significant place even without knowing its specific history. The specific silence of the preliterate world. I keep returning to this, to the absence of writing, to the specific way that the prehistoric world communicates with us only through its physical remains, because it is the central fact of the world I've been describing, and I want to give it the philosophical weight it deserves. The people who built Stonehenge and the other Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments of Britain were not less intelligent than the people who wrote the cuneiform tablets at Ugarit or the Linear B archives at Pylos. They were not less complex, not less organized, not less capable of sophisticated thought and meaningful ceremony. They simply used a different medium for preserving the record of their lives. Not words, but things. The things they made have lasted. The words from other civilizations, preserved in clay or stone or papyrus, have also lasted in many cases, but the words carry with them specific information about what the people who made them thought and believed and intended that the things alone cannot fully provide. The amber bead from the Baltic, analyzed and dated and confirmed as Bronze Age, tells us that someone moved it from the Baltic to wherever it was found. It does not tell us why. The bluest stone from the Pressley Hills, standing in the ground on Salisbury Plain, tells us that someone moved it 240 kilometers. It does not tell us what they called it. This specific silence is not a failure of the prehistoric world. It is a different kind of record, one that requires a different kind of reading, one that tells us about what people did rather than what they said, and what the prehistoric people of Britain and Northern Europe did over the 4,000 years of the Neolithic and Bronze Age was extraordinary. They built monuments that still stand. They created exchange networks that connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean. They developed astronomical knowledge precise enough to align a monument to the solstice. They moved 25-ton stones across 30 kilometers of chalk downland and managed the feat with skill and organization that we can admire but not fully understand. And they did all of this without writing a single word. The amber on the Baltic beach, the bluestones in the Presley Hills, the chalk cut into the hillside, the stones standing on the Salisbury Plain, aligned to the midsummer sun that has been rising in that direction since long before the monument was there, and will go on rising in that direction long after the monument is gone. I think about the woman on the Baltic beach sometimes, in the way that I think about specific historical people whose lives I cannot access, with a kind of particular, helpless attention that knows it cannot bridge the distance but keeps looking anyway. She did not know she was making history. She was walking on the sand after a storm, looking for the amber that the waves had uncovered, doing what her family had always done, what the families before them had always done. The exchange network she participated in was not called the Amber Road. It was just the way things were. Amber went south, bronze came north, and life continued in the specific rhythms of the Baltic autumn. And the builders, the people who quarried the spotted dolerite from Carn Godog, who split the columns from the bedrock with wooden wedges driven into the natural cracks, who dragged the stones to the coast and loaded them onto whatever watercraft could carry them across the Bristol Channel. They too did not know they were making something that would last 4,000 years. They were fulfilling an obligation. They were doing what the community had decided needed to be done, for reasons that seemed entirely clear and sufficient to them, and that we can now only guess at. The stones needed to go to Salisbury Plain. The dead needed to come from Wales. The solstice needed to be marked every year in this specific place. They left no letters, but the sun still rises where they said it would. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.